the summer of 1954, in the small town of Millfield, Georgia, everything seemed certain. Until the morning, Thomas Brennan discovered his store had been robbed. $200 gone, in a town where suspicion traveled faster than truth. Isaiah Jackson, a hard-working father, a man of faith, became the obvious suspect. Black, poor, an easy target for a community demanding swift justice. The trial seemed like a foregone conclusion, the evidence circumstantial but sufficient. The verdict inevitable. But sometimes, the truth comes from the smallest, most unexpected places. 10-year-old Lucy Mae Patterson had been sketching that fateful day. Her innocent artist's eye had captured what the adults missed, a figure in the shadows, someone who didn't belong in their narrative of guilt. In a courtroom thick with prejudice, where justice hung by a thread, one child's drawing would challenge everything they thought they knew. Would her courage be enough to save an innocent man? Or would the weight of an entire community's assumptions crush the voice of truth? This is the story of how a child's simple act of drawing became the most powerful testimony in a 1950s Southern courtroom and changed a town forever. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you're subscribed because we have many more deeply inspiring stories to share with you. The summer of 1954 hung heavy over Millfield, Georgia, like a wool blanket soaked in humidity and history. Population 3,247, according to the faded sign at the town limits, though that number hadn't been updated since the 1940 censuses. Main Street stretched exactly 4 blocks, lined with red brick buildings that had weathered 2 world wars and countless smaller battles fought in the shadows of Southern propriety. At the heart of this small community stood Brennan's General Store, an institution as fixed as the courthouse across the square. Old man Brennan had inherited the business from his father, who'd built it with his own hands in 1897. The store seen it as more than just a place to buy necessities. It was the town's unofficial gathering place where news traveled faster than the morning paper and reputations could be made or destroyed over a game of checkers. The store's wooden floors creaked with the weight of decades, and the air perpetually smelled of coffee beans, tobacco, and something indefinable that locals simply called home. Glass jars lined the shelves, filled with penny candy that drew children like moths to flame. Behind the counter, a massive cash register from 1923 rang out its mechanical symphony whenever a purchase was made. But on the morning of July 15, 1954, Brennan's General Store would become the epicenter of an event that would shake Millfield to its very foundations. Thomas Brennan arrived at his store that Thursday morning at precisely 6:30 a.m., just as he had every day for the past 37 years. At 62, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely accomplished anything worthwhile. His routine was sacred. Unlock the front door, check the till, sweep the front steps, and arrange the daily newspapers in their rack. But something was wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, though Brennan was certain he had locked it the previous evening. The morning light slanted through the opening, casting an accusatory finger across the threshold. Brennan's stomach tightened as he pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The cash register drawer hung open like a gaping mouth. Bills and coins were scattered across the counter and floor. Several jars had been knocked over, their contents spilled in chaotic patterns. The candy display case had been ransacked, with chocolate bars and peppermints strewn about like evidence of some desperate feast. But it was the amount missing that truly stunned him, nearly $200 more money than many families in Millfield saw in 3 months. The theft had been thorough, professional almost, except for the mess left behind. Brennan stood in his violated sanctuary, hands trembling slightly as he surveyed the damage. In 37 years of business, he had never been robbed. Never even had so much as a shoplifting incident that amounted to more than a child sneaking a piece of gum. At 6:45 a.m., Brennan walked the 4 blocks to Sheriff Coleman's house and knocked on the door until the lawman answered, still in his undershirt and suspenders. "Sheriff," Brennan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest, "somebody cleaned me out." By 8 a.m., news of the robbery had spread through Millfield like wildfire. In a town where the most exciting events were typically the annual corn festival and the occasional barn raising, a theft of this magnitude was nothing short of sensational. The reaction was swift and predictable. Fear mingled with outrage as neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering theories and casting suspicious glances at anyone who looked unfamiliar. The comfortable cocoon of small-town security had been torn, and everyone felt exposed. Sheriff Coleman, a man whose law enforcement experience consisted mainly of breaking up Saturday night fights and mediating disputes between neighbors, found himself facing the most serious crime of his career. At 55, Coleman had served as sheriff for 12 years, winning each election unopposed on a platform of maintaining the peace and preserving the town's traditional values. But this case would test every assumption Coleman held about his community and his ability to serve it. Within hours of the robbery's discovery, the whispers began. Mrs. Howell, who ran the boarding house on Elm Street, was the first to voice what others were thinking. "Mark my words," she told her breakfast guests, "this has the smell of outside trouble. Local folks don't steal from their neighbors. This was somebody who doesn't belong here." The sentiment spread through the town like spilled molasses, sticky and dark. By noon, theories ranged from traveling salesmen to migrant workers to outside agitators sent to stir up trouble in peaceful southern communities. But it was Deputy Frank Morrison who first spoke the words that would seal the fate of one man. "You know, there's been a colored boy hanging around town lately. That Jackson fellow from over on Colored Town Road. I've seen him walking past Brennan several times this week." The man Deputy Morrison referred to was Isaiah Jackson, a 28-year-old laborer who had moved to Millfield 6 months earlier from Alabama. Jackson worked odd jobs loading trucks, clearing land, repairing roofs, whatever honest work he could find to support his pregnant wife Mary and their 3-year-old son Samuel. Isaiah Jackson stood 6 feet tall with calloused hands that told the story of hard labor and an easy smile that had helped him find work despite the barriers he faced. He rented a small house on the edge of town, in the area locals called Colored Town, a collection of modest homes where Millfield's black residents lived in a parallel world that rarely intersected with the white community except through necessity. Jackson had no criminal record. He attended Mount Olive Baptist Church every Sunday, where Reverend Williams often praised his work ethic and character. He had never been inside Brennan's general store like most black residents of Millfield. He purchased his family's needs from Turner's Grocery in Colored Town, understanding that while he might legally be able to shop anywhere, doing so would create problems for everyone involved, but facts mattered little once suspicion took root. Deputy Morrison's observation reached Sheriff Coleman within an hour, and the sheriff found himself facing a dilemma that went far beyond simple law enforcement. The pressure to make an arrest was mounting with each passing hour. Brennan, a respected businessman and deacon at First Methodist Church, was demanding action. Mayor Pemberton, facing re-election in November, was concerned about the town's reputation and the potential impact on local businesses. And underlying it all was the unspoken understanding that in 1954, Georgia, when a crime of this magnitude occurred and no obvious white suspect presented himself, attention would inevitably turn to the black community. At 3 p.m. on July 15th, Sheriff Coleman and Deputy Morrison drove to the small house on Colored Town Road where Isaiah Jackson lived with his family. Mary Jackson was hanging laundry on the line behind their house when she saw the police car pull up. 8 months pregnant and exhausted from the heat, she watched with growing dread as the two officers approached her front door. Samuel, their toddler, was napping inside, and she prayed he wouldn't wake up and witness whatever was about to unfold. Isaiah was repairing a neighbor's fence 3 houses down when he heard the commotion. He looked up to see Sheriff Coleman talking to his wife, whose posture had grown rigid with fear. Something cold settled in Isaiah's stomach as he set down his hammer and walked toward his home. "Isaiah Jackson?" Sheriff Coleman asked as he approached. "Yes, sir," Isaiah replied, removing his work gloves. "I need you to come with me. We've got some questions about the robbery at Brennan's store." The words hit Isaiah like a physical blow. "Sir, I don't know anything about any robbery. I've never even been inside Mr. Brennan's store." "That's what we need to talk about," Coleman said, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over. "You can come willingly, or we can do this the hard way." Mary Jackson watched her husband being led to the police car, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. She had seen this scene played out too many times in too many places. A black man accused, evidence or no evidence, and a system that presumed guilt rather than innocence. As the police car disappeared down the dusty road, Mary sank into a chair on her front porch and began to cry not just for her husband, but for the child she carried who would be born into a world where the color of one's skin could determine one's fate, regardless of truth or justice. By evening, Word of Isaiah Jackson's arrest had spread through both sides of Millfield. In the white community, there was a sense of relief that the perpetrator had been caught so quickly. In Colored Town, there was a familiar dread, the kind that came with knowing that being accused was often indistinguishable from being convicted. The Millfield County Jail occupied the basement of the courthouse, a fact that seemed symbolically appropriate to those who understood the building's dual role in the community's power structure. The jail consisted of 3 cells, rarely occupied except for the occasional drunk or domestic dispute that required a cooling-off period. Isaiah Jackson found himself in the middle cell, staring at walls that had been painted green sometime in the 1932 and not touched since. The paint peeled in places, revealing older layers underneath a palimpsest of neglect and indifference. Sheriff Coleman had questioned him for 3 hours without result. Jackson maintained his innocence with a quiet dignity that somehow irritated the sheriff more than anger or pleading might have. "Look, Isaiah," Coleman had said during the interrogation, "this can go easy or hard. We know you were in town yesterday. We know you've been struggling to find work. $200 would solve a lot of problems for a man in your situation." "Sheriff Coleman," Isaiah had replied, "I may be poor, but I'm not a thief. I've never stolen so much as a penny from anyone, and I'm not about to start now." But Coleman was facing pressures Isaiah couldn't fully comprehend. Mayor Pemberton had called twice, emphasizing the need for a quick resolution. Thomas Brennan had stopped by the sheriff's office, accompanied by 3 other prominent businessmen, all of whom expressed their concern about the community's safety. More troubling were the conversations Coleman overheard at the diner and barbershop. Talk of taking matters into our own hands and sending a message that made the sheriff's job suddenly about more than just solving a robbery. In the charged atmosphere of 1954 Georgia, a black man accused of stealing from a white merchant was walking a tightrope over an abyss. Coleman was a decent man in many ways, but he was also a product of his time and place. The idea that Isaiah Jackson might be innocent conflicted with his assumptions about the natural order of things. It was easier to believe that a poor black man might steal than to consider that someone else, someone white, might be responsible. The case against Jackson was circumstantial at best. He had been seen in town on the day of the robbery. He needed money. He had no alibi for the crucial hours between 6 p.m. Wednesday and 6 a.m. Thursday when the crime occurred. To Coleman's thinking, that was enough. But there were troubling gaps in the case that the sheriff chose to ignore. No fingerprints had been found at the scene. The store had been wiped clean. No witness had actually seen Jackson near Brennan's store on Wednesday evening. And most puzzling of all, none of the stolen money had been found despite a thorough search of Jackson's home. These inconsistencies might have given a more experienced investigator pause, but Coleman was under too much pressure to look too closely at inconvenient details. On Friday morning, July 16th, Judge Clarence Hartwell was contacted at his home and informed that the state would be seeking an indictment for grand theft. Hartwell, a man whose judicial philosophy aligned perfectly with the social order he had inherited, scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following Monday. The wheels of justice, such as they were in Millfield, had begun to turn. While the adults of Millfield wrestled with questions of guilt and innocence, justice and order, one member of the community observed the unfolding drama through different eyes entirely. Lucy Mae Patterson was 10 years old, small for her age, with auburn hair that refused to stay in the braids her mother attempted each morning. She was the daughter of Robert Patterson, who served as janitor for the courthouse, the school, and several other municipal buildings. In the rigid social hierarchy of Millfield, the Pattersons occupied an unusual position: white but poor, respectable but relegated to the margins of polite society. Robert Patterson was a quiet man who had lost his left arm in a factory accident 15 years earlier, ending his dreams of skilled work and leaving him dependent on jobs that required more endurance than strength. He performed his duties with dignity and thoroughness, arriving early and staying late to ensure that every floor was spotless and every trash can emptied. Lucy Mae often accompanied her father to his work sites during summer vacation, partly because her mother worked as a seamstress and couldn't supervise her during the day, and partly because she genuinely enjoyed the quiet companionship of her father's presence. She had learned to entertain herself for hours, armed with a sketchbook and a small tin of colored pencils that her grandmother had given her for Christmas. Drawing was Lucy Mae's passion and escape. She had an artist's eye for detail and an intuitive understanding of perspective that impressed her teachers. More importantly, she had developed the artist's habit of truly seeing the world around her, noticing things that others missed because they were too busy, too distracted, or too convinced they already knew what was worth their attention. On Wednesday afternoon, July 14th, while her father cleaned the courthouse, Lucy May had stationed herself on the front steps with her sketchbook. The courthouse faced Main Street, Prov, hiding an excellent view of Brennan's general store across the square. She had decided to draw the street scene, attempting to capture the lazy afternoon atmosphere of small-town summer. She worked slowly and carefully, sketching the outlines of buildings, adding details like the awning over Brennan's store and the cluster of rocking chairs outside the barbershop. As she drew, she observed the natural rhythm of the town people entering and leaving the store, children playing in the square, farmers in overalls discussing crops and weather. At approximately 5:30 p.m., her attention was caught by a figure moving quickly along the side of Brennan's store. The person seemed to be trying to avoid being seen, staying close to the building's shadow and glancing around nervously. Lucy May's artistic training had taught her to notice movement and gesture, and something about this person's behavior struck her as furtive, almost guilty. Without really thinking about why, she began sketching the figure, trying to capture not just the physical details but the sense of urgency and secrecy that characterized their movements. The person was too far away for her to make out facial features clearly, but she could see enough to record height, build, and clothing. The figure disappeared around the back of the store, and Lucy May returned to her broader street scene, thinking little more about the incident. Children develop an instinctive understanding of adult business and their place in it. She had learned that most of what she observed was either boring to adults or none of her concern. But when the news of the robbery spread through town the next day, and especially when Isaiah Jackson was arrested on Friday, Lucy May found herself thinking about her sketch. She pulled out her pad and studied the drawing she had made of the mysterious figure. The person she had drawn was definitely not Isaiah Jackson. The figure in her sketch was shorter, stockier, with light-colored hair visible beneath. A cap. The clothing was different too, work pants and a light-colored shirt, not the darker clothing that Jackson typically wore. Most importantly, the person had entered the store through what appeared to be a back entrance, suggesting knowledge of the building's layout and possibly access to keys. Lucy May stared at her drawing, understanding instinctively that she possessed information that might be important. But she was also 10 years old, living in a world where children's observations carried little weight, especially when they contradicted the conclusions reached by adults. She showed the sketch to her father that evening as they walked home from the courthouse. "Daddy," she said, "I drew this person going into Mr. Brennan's store yesterday right around supper time, but they arrested that colored man, Mr. Jackson. This doesn't look like him at all." Robert Patterson studied his daughter's drawing, recognizing both her artistic skill and her eye for detail. The figure she had captured did indeed look nothing like Isaiah Jackson, but Robert also understood the delicate position his family occupied in Millfield's social structure. Speaking up might be the right thing to do, but it could also have consequences for his employment and his family's welfare. "Lucy May," he said carefully, "this is a very good drawing, but sometimes things are more complicated than they appear. The sheriff and the judge know what they're doing." But even as he spoke the words, Robert Patterson felt the weight of compromise settling on his conscience. He had spent his life accepting the world as it was rather than challenging it to become what it should be. Now his daughter was asking him to choose between safety and truth, and he wasn't sure he had the courage to choose correctly. That night, Lucy May lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Isaiah Jackson sitting in the courthouse jail. She had seen him around town, had watched him tip his hat politely to her father when their paths crossed. He had kind eyes and a gentle way of speaking to his small son. She thought about her drawing, hidden now in her sketchbook, and wondered if a 10-year-old girl's observations could possibly matter in a world run by adults who seemed so certain of their conclusions. She was about to learn that sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places, and that courage can emerge from the smallest and most unlikely sources. The weekend before Isaiah Jackson's preliminary hearing brought a restless energy to Millfield that reminded longtime residents of the atmosphere before a powerful thunderstorm. The air seemed charged with potential, heavy with the promise of change and the threat of violence. At Mount Olive Baptist Church on Sunday morning, Reverend Williams delivered a sermon that walked a careful line between comfort and challenge. Speaking to a congregation that included Mary Jackson, now alone and visibly pregnant, he chose his text from the book of Isaiah, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. The Reverend's words carried a weight that extended beyond their biblical context. Every person in that small church understood that they were living through a moment that would define their community for years to come. The question was whether they would be defined by courage or by complicity. After the service, church members gathered around Mary Jackson, offering what support they could. Food appeared on her table, delivered by neighbors who understood that her husband's imprisonment had eliminated their family's only source of income. Children from the congregation took turns watching 3-year-old Samuel, understanding without being told that their mothers needed to help however they could. But underneath the community's support ran an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew that challenging the white power structure's conclusions about Isaiah Jackson carried risks that extended far beyond any individual family. History had taught them that black communities often paid collectively for the actions of individual members, guilty or innocent. Meanwhile, in the white community, Sunday morning brought its own tensions. At First Methodist Church, Deacon Brennan sat in his usual pew, surrounded by sympathy and support from his fellow parishioners. But he found it difficult to concentrate on Reverend Mackenzie. Sermon about forgiveness and Christian charity when his own thoughts were consumed with anger and the desire for retribution. After church, the usual gathering at the diner took on an uglier tone than normal. Conversations that began with expressions of support for Brennan gradually shifted toward discussions of appropriate punishment and the need to send a clear message about property rights and social order. 20 years in prison isn't enough for this kind of thing, declared hardware store owner Pete Morrison, Deputy Morrison's older brother. A man works his whole life to build something and then some thief thinks he can just take it. There has to be consequences. Others nodded in agreement and the conversation grew darker. Talk of frontier justice and taking care of our own problems began to surface, the kind of language that had historically preceded some of the South's darkest chapters. Sheriff Coleman, who had stopped by the diner for his usual Sunday lunch, listened to these conversations with growing unease. He had solved his case, arrested his suspect, and satisfied the community's demand for swift action. But the mood in the diner suggested that some folks weren't content to let the legal system run its course. That afternoon, Coleman drove out to the Jackson house to check on Mary and the boy. He told himself it was routine police work, but truthfully, he was beginning to feel uncomfortable about the direction. Events were taking. Mary Jackson met him at the front door, her composure intact despite the strain visible in her eyes. "Mrs. Jackson," Coleman said, removing his hat, "I wanted to check and see if you and the boy needed anything." "We're managing, Sheriff," Mary replied, her voice steady. "The church folks have been kind." Coleman nodded, then found himself saying something he hadn't planned to say. "Mrs. Jackson, your husband maintains he's innocent. I want you to know that he'll get a fair hearing tomorrow." Mary looked at him for a long moment before responding. "Sheriff Coleman, I appreciate you coming by. But we both know that fairness isn't always the same as justice, especially for folks who look like my husband." Her words stayed with Coleman as he drove back into town. He had always prided himself on being a fair man, someone who treated all citizens with respect regardless of color. But Mary Jackson's quiet dignity and her husband's consistent denials were beginning to plant seeds of doubt that Coleman wasn't sure he wanted to cultivate. That evening, as the sun set over Millfield, Lucy Mae Patterson sat on her family's front porch, her sketchbook open to the drawing she had made of the mysterious figure at Brennan's store. She had looked at the sketch dozens of times over the weekend, each time becoming more certain that the person she had drawn was not Isaiah Jackson. The weight of her knowledge felt enormous to her 10-year-old mind. She understood that adults were preparing to send a man to prison for many years based on their belief that he was guilty. She also understood that her drawing might prove he was innocent, but she was just a child, the daughter of a janitor, and nobody had asked for her opinion. As darkness fell over the town, Lucy Mae made a decision that would require more courage than anyone should have to ask of a 10-year-old girl. She would find a way to make her voice heard, even if it meant standing up to every adult in Millfield who had already made up their minds about Isaiah Jackson's guilt. The trial was scheduled to begin the next morning, and Lucy Mae spent a sleepless night preparing for the most important conversation of her young life. Monday morning, July 19th, 1954, dawned hot and humid, with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made shirts stick to backs and tempers run short. By 8 a.m., a crowd had gathered outside the Millfield County Courthouse, drawn by the prospect of witnessing the most significant legal proceeding in the town's recent memory. The courthouse, built in 1897, stood as a monument to Southern architectural grandeur, with white columns that had been painted and repainted dozens of times to maintain their pristine appearance. The building housed not just the courtroom, but also the sheriff's office, the mayor's office, and various other municipal functions. On most days, it was a quiet place where the business of local government proceeded at a deliberate, unhurried pace. But today was different. Today, the courthouse would serve as the stage for a drama that would test every assumption the community held about justice, truth, and the social order that had governed their lives for generations. Judge Clarence Hartwell arrived at his chambers at 8:30 a.m., as was his custom. At 67, Hartwell had presided over the Millfield County Court for 23 years, earning a reputation for stern fairness and unwavering adherence to legal precedent. He was a man who believed deeply in the importance of order, both legal and social, and who viewed his role as maintaining the stability that allowed communities like Millfield to function. Hartwell's judicial philosophy had been shaped by his understanding of Southern history and his belief that rapid change led to chaos. He prided himself on treating all defendants with dignity while ensuring that justice was served according to the law as he understood it. The fact that his understanding of justice had rarely been challenged by cases involving racial tensions was something he preferred not to examine too closely. This morning, however, Hartwell felt an unusual weight of responsibility. The case against Isaiah Jackson was straightforward. In legal terms, the state would present its evidence, the defense would respond, and he would make his determination based on the law and the facts presented. But he also understood that his decision would resonate far beyond the courthouse walls, affecting not just Jackson and his family, but the entire community's sense of justice and order. At 9 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order, and the preliminary hearing for the state of Georgia versus Isaiah Jackson officially began. The courtroom filled quickly, with white residents claiming the main seating area and black residents relegated to a smaller section in the back. The segregated seating was so automatic, so unquestioned, that most people took their places without conscious thought. This was simply how things were done, how they had always been done, and how everyone expected them to continue being done. Isaiah Jackson entered the courtroom flanked by his court-appointed attorney, a young lawyer named David Morrison, no relation to the deputy, despite the shared surname. Morrison was 26 years old, fresh out of law school, and had been assigned to the case by Judge Hartwell when it became clear that Jackson couldn't afford private representation. David Morrison was an idealistic young man who had studied law because he believed in justice and the power of the legal system to protect the innocent. But he was also pragmatic enough to understand that his client faced enormous disadvantages that had nothing to do with the facts of the case. In 1954, Georgia, a black man accused of stealing from a white merchant was presumed guilty by most members of the community regardless of the evidence. Morrison had spent the weekend reviewing the case file and interviewing his client. He was troubled by the weakness of the state's evidence: no physical evidence, no eyewitness testimony, no recovery of stolen goods, no prior criminal history. The case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence and the assumption that Jackson, as a poor black man, must be guilty of something. But Morrison also understood that reasonable doubt was a luxury that black defendants rarely enjoyed in Southern courtrooms. He would have to present a defense that not only established his client's innocence, but did so in a way that didn't challenge the community's fundamental assumptions about race and social order. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney William Hutchinson, a man whose political ambitions were well known throughout the county. Hutchinson was 45 years old, with a kind of polished appearance and smooth-speaking style that played well with juries. He had never lost a case involving a black defendant, a fact that he considered evidence of his legal skill rather than systemic bias. Hutchinson opened his case with a presentation that emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the threat it posed to the community's safety and prosperity. He painted Isaiah Jackson as a desperate man who had turned to theft when legitimate opportunities failed to meet his needs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hutchinson told the packed courtroom, "we are here today because someone violated the trust that holds our community together. Someone decided that the property of others was available for the taking. Someone believed that hard work and honest enterprise could be replaced by theft and deception. Hutchinson's opening statement was crafted to appeal to the deepest fears of his audience, the fear that their way of life was under attack, that the social order they depended on was being threatened by those who refused to accept their proper place within it. The prosecutor then presented his evidence. Isaiah Jackson had been seen in town on the day of the robbery. He needed money to support his pregnant wife and young son. He had no alibi for the crucial hours when the crime occurred. The theft required someone familiar with the town and the store's routines. Jackson, despite being a relative newcomer, had been observed walking past the store on multiple occasions. To Hutchinson, this circumstantial evidence formed a compelling narrative of guilt. To David Morrison, it represented the kind of assumptions and stereotypes that had led to countless miscarriages of justice throughout Southern history. Morrison's defense strategy was necessarily limited. He couldn't present an alternative suspect without evidence, and he couldn't challenge the community's assumptions about race without alienating the very jury he was trying to convince. Instead, he focused on the weakness of the state's case and the fundamental principle that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. "Your Honor," Morrison said in his opening statement, "the prosecution asks you to convict my client based on speculation and assumption rather than evidence and proof. They ask you to believe that being poor and black in 1954 Georgia is sufficient evidence of criminal intent. This is not justice. This is prejudice disguised as law." Morrison's words created a visible tension in the courtroom. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in approval or disapproval depending on their perspective. Judge Hartwell maintained his impassive expression, but Morrison's direct challenge to the community's assumptions had introduced an element of uncertainty into what many had expected to be a straightforward proceeding. As the morning progressed, witness after witness took the stand to testify about Jackson's presence in town, his financial difficulties, and his lack of an alibi. The testimony was damaging not because it proved guilt, but because it confirmed the narrative that the prosecution had constructed, a narrative that fit comfortably within the community's expectations and prejudices. But as the lunch recess approached, neither the prosecution nor the defense was aware that their careful legal strategies were about to be disrupted by an intervention from the most unlikely source imaginable. In the back of the courtroom, largely unnoticed by the adults focused on the dramatic proceedings, sat a 10-year-old girl with auburn hair and a sketchbook clutched tightly in her small hands. Lucy Mae Patterson had been watching the trial with the intense concentration that children bring to events they sense are important, even when they don't fully understand all the implications. And Lucy Mae Patterson was about to change everything. During the lunch recess, as lawyers and spectators filed out of the courthouse for their midday meal, Lucy Mae Patterson remained in her seat, staring at the empty witness stand and gathering courage for what she knew she had to do. Her father, Robert Patterson, had been cleaning the courthouse that morning as usual, moving quietly through the building's corridors and empty rooms while the drama of the trial unfolded in the courtroom. He had given Lucy Mae permission to sit in the back during the proceedings, understanding that history was being made and that his daughter might learn something from witnessing the legal system at work. But Lucy Mae had learned more than her father had bargained for. She had learned that adults, even well-meaning adults, could convince themselves of things that weren't true. She had learned that being poor and black could be treated as evidence of guilt. And she had learned that sometimes the truth needed a champion, even if that champion was just a 10-year-old girl with a sketchbook. As the courtroom emptied, Lucy Mae approached the bailiff, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson who had known her family for years. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to the judge. I have something important to show him." Henderson looked down at the small girl with a mixture of amusement and confusion. "Now, Lucy Mae, the judge is very busy with important legal matters. What could you possibly have to show him?" Lucy Mae opened her sketchbook to the drawing she had made of the mysterious figure at Brennan's store. "I drew this person going into the store the day it was robbed. This isn't Mr. Jackson, this is someone else." Henderson studied the drawing, his expression shifting from amusement to interest to concern. The figure in the sketch was clearly not Isaiah Jackson. The height, build, and coloring were all wrong. If the drawing was accurate, it represented evidence that could dramatically change the course of the trial. "Lucy Mae," Henderson said carefully, "this is a very serious matter. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" "Yes, sir," Lucy Mae replied, her voice gaining strength. "I was sitting on the courthouse steps drawing the street scene. I saw this person acting sneaky around the side of Mr. Brennan's store, so I drew them. I'm sure it wasn't Mr. Jackson. Henderson found himself facing a dilemma that illustrated the complexities of Southern society in 1954. A child's testimony, especially a child from a working-class family, carried little weight in legal proceedings. But a child's observations might also be more honest and less influenced by the prejudices and assumptions that colored adult perspectives. "Wait here," Henderson told Lucy May. "I need to speak to Judge Hartwell." Judge Hartwell was in his chambers, reviewing his notes from the morning's proceedings and eating a sandwich his wife had prepared. The case against Jackson seemed solid, if not overwhelming, and Hartwell expected to conclude the preliminary hearing that afternoon with a decision to bind the defendant over for trial. Henderson's knock interrupted his thoughts. "Judge," Henderson said, "there's a situation that requires your attention." Robert Patterson's daughter says she witnessed something the day of the robbery that might be relevant to the case. Hartwell looked up from his notes, irritation flashing across his face. "Henderson, we can't have children disrupting legal proceedings based on their imaginations." "Send her home, sir," Henderson persisted. "I think you should look at what she has to show you. She's drawn a picture of someone at the store that day, and it doesn't look anything like the defendant." The bailiff's insistence gave Hartwell pause. Henderson was a careful man, not given to flights of fancy or inappropriate dramatics. If he thought the child's information was worth the judge's attention, there might be substance to it. "Very well," Hartwell said with a sigh. "Bring her in, but this had better be worth interrupting my lunch." Lucy May entered the judge's chambers with the kind of nervous determination that children display when they know they're about to do something that will change everything. Judge Hartwell, imposing in his black robes, looked down at her with an expression that mixed skepticism with curiosity. "Young lady," Hartwell said, "Mr. Henderson tells me you have information about the robbery at Brennan's store. What exactly did you see?" Lucy May opened her sketchbook to the relevant page, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the judge's desk. As silence blanketed the Millfield County courtroom that sweltering Monday afternoon, Judge Hartwell returned to the bench with a stern, unreadable expression. The whispers from the back of the room, the segregated section where Mary Jackson clutched her son, were stilled with a single gavel strike. "Before proceeding," the judge announced, his voice heavy with the gravity of what had transpired, "there is new evidence that must be entered into the record." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom as Lucy May Patterson was called to the stand. Heads craned, breaths held. She seemed impossibly small, the sketchbook pressed tightly in her hands as she climbed into the witness chair. Her legs dangled, not quite reaching the floor. David Morrison, Isaiah Jackson's young attorney, approached gently. "Lucy May, would you please tell the court what you saw the day before the robbery?" Shifting nervously, Lucy May opened her sketchbook. "I was sitting on the courthouse steps, drawing Main Street, when I saw someone acting sneaky at the back of Mr. Brennan's store. He wasn't Mr. Jackson. He was shorter and had light hair, wearing a cap and light shirt." Murmurs grew louder. The drawing, when passed to the judge and lawyers, confirmed every word, a figure utterly unlike the accused. District Attorney Hutchinson tried to object, but Hartwell silenced him with a glance. "This court will hear the child's testimony." Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as hope flickered on his client's face for the first time. "Did you see where this person went?" Lucy May nodded. "Yes, sir. He went into the back door. He looked scared. He wasn't Mr. Jackson. I saw Mr. Jackson later that day, and he was across town." With every word, the brick wall of certainty built against Isaiah Jackson began to crumble. Several faces in the crowd, white and black alike, began to question what they thought they knew. Judge Hartwell leaned forward, peering over the rim of his glasses at Sheriff F. Coleman. "Sheriff, was this back entrance known to many?" Coleman shook his head, voice dry. "Only a few old-timers and some employees." "Town folks, sir. Mr. Jackson wouldn't have a key." A long, heavy silence. The weight of prejudice, habit, and fear squeezed the air from the room. But Lucy May's simple, honest drawing, her courage, bore the truth no one else dared speak. The judge spoke at last, his southern baritone grave with the import of having his own certainty shaken. "Given this new evidence, the court cannot proceed against Mr. Jackson based on assumption and circumstance alone. I order Isaiah Jackson released immediately and an inquiry opened to determine the actual perpetrator. Justice must serve truth, not convenience, nor prejudice." As handcuffs were removed from Isaiah Jackson's wrists, he looked first to his wife, then to the small girl in the front row. The two locked eyes, one man saved, one girl forever changed by the knowledge that sometimes the smallest voice can awaken the conscience of an entire town. The courtroom doors opened, and light flooded the room, bringing with it, for the first time in days, a sense that real justice might finally find its way to Millfield.